Hello everyone, welcome to a new YouTube video. In this video I want to talk about a question that's being posted. I do like to do sometimes a video rather than answer it in text because it can be more informative to the viewer, and I do appreciate you guys watching my videos, and I always do try and reply to questions because it's always good to get interaction, isn't it? There's a lot of YouTubers out there who don't like to communicate with their viewers or reply to questions, or rarely do. So I want to be different. So if you do subscribe, I do appreciate it. And if you've got questions, I will try and reply, providing I have something to contribute. So without further ado, let's go to a question. So Stacey X has posted a question, and that question is: I just bought a T7i camera with an STM lens. Now I want to talk about your camera, Stacey, because I think there's a few things you need to know about it. First of all, it's a crop sensor camera, so it will basically make any telephoto lens a bit longer. An example of that is if you bought the EF, which is a full frame lens, right, and put it on your T7i camera, it will extend the focal length from 50mm to 80, which is good for portraiture, don't get me wrong, but if you want to do wide angle things, it's not so great. So it can be a bit of a problem if you want to do landscapes. I just wanted to bring that up first of all. Now, your camera has 24 megapixels, can take 6 frames per second. However, the problem with the budget SLR cameras is the buffer size is very small. And now if you don't know what that means, it's like a small amount of memory on your camera. Now if you're taking lots of large files quickly, that buffer will fill up quickly, and you have to wait for that to offload to a memory card, and that's what we refer to as the buffer. How long it takes to offload the image from your camera memory to your memory card. Now, it's not a problem if you're doing portraiture or landscapes, but if you're doing fast moving action, it could be a problem. So I had the 600D, so you can use them, don't get me wrong. I actually started my channel using a 600D camera, which is similar to yours. The UK equivalent of your T7i is the 800D, if everyone would like to know that. With your particular camera, it has a hybrid Cosmos dual pixel AF, which is pretty good at doing tracking. So I'm actually filming on the 80D, which is the semi-pro version of your camera, and it does have a crop factor of 1.6. So if you ever buy an EF lens designed for full frame, you just need to multiply the millimeters by 1.6, so 50mm becomes 80mm. Let's just work out what 24mm, which is pretty standard as a wide angle lens. So 24mm becomes 38mm, not so wide angle, so it's not great for doing wide angle shots. So it's a camera for beginners really, and you'll find it quite useful for doing all sorts of different types of photography. You'll still feel the camera is a bit cheap, and you'll want to upgrade to something more semi-professional. So what would you like to upgrade to? Well, there are two cameras I would recommend. The 70D or the 80D are fine cameras, and you will certainly be more than pleased with those cameras, and they do have a really good buffer. You can take 25 raw images before the buffer has a slowdown effect. If you've got a bit more money, consider the 7D Mark II. Hopefully the 7D Mark III will be released by the time you're ready for a new camera. Personally, I went for a second-hand 7D. Sometimes, rather than getting a brand new budget SLR camera, you can buy a second-hand older camera, and sometimes that older camera can be better. because it's just, I'd rather have a semi-pro camera than a budget camera that I might want to upgrade in the future. So just consider that. Don't get me wrong, your T7i will certainly do you justice for the meantime. It can still do good video, just like the 80D can, the 7D Mark II, even the full frame 5D Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV. You know, there's lots of cameras out there, obviously. But, you know, just consider possibly upgrading in the future to a 7D or a 80D or 90D. There's rumours of that coming out soon. I'm hoping that the new 90D, when it comes out, will have 4K video. I don't tend to do a lot of 4K video because I find 180p is fine for me. But in the future I may wish to upgrade to 4K. But it's up to you. Obviously it's more money. Right, to your question, Stacey. So let's read it out. I'm so clueless but very passionate about doing this. This is all very new to me. Which lenses would you recommend for close-up, portrait and landscape photography? Well, there's many lenses, Stacey, out there, and it really depends on your budget. So let's start off with the STM lens. I presume you've got the 18 to 55, which is still a very good lens. Sure, you can get better lenses than that lens, but a thing you might want to consider investing in is some lighting equipment. You know, lighting equipment can change a very small apertured lens, right, like the STM lens you've got, which is, I think it's 4.5 to f16, something like that. But it's still quite a small aperture that lets not much light through. And you won't be able to blur the background out very much with that lens as well. And I suspect if you're doing portraiture, you'll want to blur the background out a lot. So you might want to consider possibly, if you've got the finances, is going for the 70 to 200 2.8 lens or the f4 version, which is significantly cheaper. I think the f4 goes for about $800, something like that. The 2.8 version is probably closer to $2,500. It all depends on your money, really. And I want to talk about L lenses versus non-L lenses, because that's something you might want to consider. Why do people buy L lenses? Well, L lenses let more light in, they're more durable, you can drop them and they'll survive. I have dropped quite a few L lenses, and I'm very thankful that I have them, because if you do drop them, there's a good chance they won't smash. Non-L lenses, like the consumer lenses that Canon do, the STM lenses for example, if I was to drop them on concrete, I'd be really surprised if they survived. Let's talk about diminishing returns on image quality. So L lenses tend to be 10 to 20% sharper than the non-L lens counterparts. But you have to spend a lot more money to get that extra 10 or 20%. So it depends, do you think that 10 or 20% is worth it? So we've talked about image quality briefly. The other thing you want to consider is how much a bigger aperture lets more light in. How much is that worth to you? You see, an f4 lens lets in quite a lot of light, but a 2.8 lens lets in 4 times more light. The 2.8 lenses are very expensive, and generally they're referred to as the big white lenses. In terms of what you're looking for, if you're going to do portraiture photography, I would certainly recommend the EF 1.8 STM lens. It's not quite as sharp as the 1.2 lens, which is a damn sight more expensive. The 1.2 lens retails for about, I think it's $2,000, where you can pick up the non-L lens, 50 EF lens, for about probably $150 or £100. And it's not that less sharp, you know, compared to its L lens equivalent. So I would certainly recommend that lens. Another lens you might want to check out is also a macro lens, which is the Canon EF 100 2.8 macro lens. Now that lens is very sharp. Now it's not a zoom, keep that in mind. It's fixed focal length, but it'll give you a good isolation of your subject. Plus you can do close-up photography, because I noticed you said you want to do close-up photography. Another thing you want to consider getting is extension tubes. Now what that does is it makes the distance between your lens and your camera greater. So you lose infinity focus. However, it means you can focus a lot closer. You know, you can literally photograph a 10p coin and fill it in the frame, literally, because that's how close you can get. Landscape photography. What you've got to remember, Stacey, is your camera is a crop sensor camera, 1.6 crop. So it means any wide angle lens you get, you need to multiply the length of the lens by that crop factor. So let's just get the calculator out. I know it can be complicated, this, because full frame versus crop sensor. When you put a 50mm lens on a full frame camera, it's 50mm. But when you put it on a crop sensor camera, it becomes 80mm. So it makes it longer. But the problem is, when you want to go wide, it's not great. So let's say you get a lens that's 10mm. Now you need to times that by 1.6. That's giving you 16mm. And that's a good wide angle view. Now I would recommend the STM 10 to 18mm lens. It's pretty good. It's pretty cheap at £300. I think it's about $450, something like that. And you'll find that useful for doing wide angle stuff. But not only that, you can do blogs with that. You know, if you're the type of person that's looking to do blogs on YouTube, it's the perfect kit really for you. In fact, I own that lens because of the universal. I own that lens because it's so universal. So the reason I bought it was to do property photography. You know, yes, it has a dark aperture of. So the 10 to 18mm has an f4.5 to 5.6 aperture, so it doesn't let a lot of light in. But if you've got lots of lights, utilise those. The great thing about this lens is the autofocus is silent. Just the same as the 18 to 55mm lens, the autofocus is silent. So it's fantastic if you want to film yourself and not hear the lens ticking. Another thing you want to invest on would be an external microphone. Get one of the Rode microphones. I use the Video To Go one. It doesn't require batteries, but there are others out there. But yeah, you'll want an external microphone if you do any sort of video work at all. Obviously, you've stated you want to do photography, but I suspect you'll want to do video at some point as well. That's more or less what I started doing. So for landscape photography, I would certainly recommend that 10 to 18mm lens. It's really nice, and you do get the equivalent of 16mm, which is equivalent to some of the L lenses that Canon do for their full frame cameras. So I think that's probably the cheapest way of getting really wide. Problem is, it's really hard to use L lenses on crop sensor cameras, because the widest you'll probably get, you know, within a reasonable amount of money, that is, would be, so the equivalent to the 10 to 18 millimeter EFS lens is probably going to be the L lens, which is a Canon EF 17 to 40mm f4 lens. You can pick those up for about $1,200, something like that. But it's all about money really. How much money have you got to spend? If you've not got a lot of money and you're just starting out, I would recommend you go for the EFS lenses. So there's 3 lenses I would recommend. One would be the 10 to 18 EFS wide angle lens, as I've mentioned. That will give you equivalent focal length of 16mm to 55mm, which is pretty good. Now you already own a good lens, the 18 to 55mm lens. So Stacey, the lens you already own, the 18 to 55 STM lens, which is a good lens, is equivalent of 28mm to 88mm. So it's a good range, and you'll think that's a pretty good lens. I would agree with that. I also noticed someone recommended the 55 to 250 STM lens. It's a good lens. It's pretty sharp. It's just not on the same level as the Canon 100 to 400 lens. Just keep that in mind. It is equivalent of 400mm, so you do get a lot of reach from it. So those 3 lenses will probably set you back about $600 if you were to buy them all, obviously. So if you're on a budget, I would recommend you buy those 3 lenses. You also may wish to buy the EF 50mm 1.8 lens. It works out at 80mm, and it's really good for doing portraiture if you want to blow out the background. However, I would recommend that you don't use the aperture of 1.8. The main reason for that, if you're going to do portraiture, right, is it has a tendency, and if you're not experienced in doing portraiture photography, if someone is directly looking at you with the 2 eyes like that, and you've got one eye in focus, the other eye will probably be in focus. However, if someone was to move the head slightly to the left, where one eye is in front of the other, you'll miss your focus. So one eye will be in focus, and the eye behind, right, which is a little bit further back, will be out of focus. That is what you're playing with when you talk about extreme apertures, such as 1.8, 1.2. Basically, your aperture is like that, and the more you go down, such as 1.8 to 1.2, the bigger the hole becomes in the lens, but the more light it lets in, but the less depth of field you've got to play with. As the hole gets smaller and the aperture comes down to f4, 5.6, f8, your depth of field is much bigger to play with. So that's the problem when you buy lenses such as the 50mm 1.8, is you've got to really nail your focus and be careful with it. It is a lens I would recommend, the EF 50mm lens. It works out at 80mm on crop sensor cameras, and it is amazingly cheap for what you get, and it's a fantastic lens. I own it myself. In fact, if you want to check out my video where I did a introduction of the Sigma 500mm lens, so I actually did a funny review of the 500mm Sigma lens with that 50mm EF lens on the 80D, which is a crop sensor camera, and it was pretty good. The focus was fine. It's so fantastic that you can blow out the background with that 1.8 aperture, but like I said, you've got to be really careful on the focus. So in terms of lenses I would recommend for you if you're just starting out using the crop sensor camera you've got, is the 10 to 18mm EFS lens, the 50mm EF lens, the 18 to 55, which you already own, and yes, I would recommend the 55 to 250 STM lens as well. It's very nice. You do get sharp images from that. It's pretty good if you want to do wildlife work or any sort of sports photography on a budget. So I reckon all those lenses would probably set you back about $800 at the most, and it's a good kit. But I think if you're going to get those lenses, remember they have small apertures, so they don't let a lot of light in. So if you're going to use those lenses, you're going to need lighting equipment. If you're going to do any sort of portraiture work with your friends or models, or if you're going to do any blogging videos, you're going to need lighting equipment. They are fantastic lenses, and the 18 to 55 and the 10 to 18 and the 55 to 250 autofocus in video is silent. It's fantastic for that. So I recommend those lenses. However, if you're considering becoming a professional, I would certainly recommend you consider buying Canon L lenses. So I would still stick with the EF 50mm lens. Maybe when you've got the money, consider getting the 1.2 50mm lens. If you're going to do portraiture seriously, I would certainly recommend you consider buying that, but it's not cheap. Even myself, I just struggle to justify the cost of that lens. It's a specialty lens, but it's very expensive. If you're going to do wide angle, and say you consider changing your camera to full frame, so when it comes to professional lenses, and say you want to go professional at some point, you're going to be considering the 24 to 105 and the 24 to 80 f4 lenses. They let more light in. Remember what I said about the large aperture? Lets more light in. In sunrise, sunset, you're going to be wanting those big apertures. And if you're doing portraiture work, you also want the big apertures, because the bigger the aperture, the more you can blur out the background. You can sort of simulate some of that with zoom lenses, using like 200mm, 400mm. However, if you want to stick to short lenses, you're going to want big apertures. Let's talk about telephoto lenses that I would recommend. I would recommend the 70 to 200 2.8 lens. It's a fantastic lens. It's got to be the most versatile lens you'll ever own if you buy that lens. It's very expensive though, so I suspect it's about $2,500, something like that. And it has an aperture of 2.8. So you remember I said f4, so big, lets lots of light in. 2.8 is huge, lets a lot more light in, and it blurs the background out really nicely. And in terms of the ultimate portrait lens, that is it really. It's what every professional uses. I own it. I've dropped it a few times and it survived. And it's solidly built, it's weather sealed, and it's got to be the ultimate lens really. Image stabilization, the recent release, the Mark II, has 4 stops. So what that means is it gives you extra stabilization while hand holding. So one stop is an increment of how much stabilization it gives you. So say you've got f1.8, then you've got f2.8, then you've got f4, then you've got 5.6. So you've got 4 levels of image stabilization on that particular lens. On the budget lenses I briefly told you about, the STM lenses, they typically give you about 3 stops of image stabilization, and Canon's image stabilization is fantastic. It beats virtually every other company out there in my opinion. Tamron's close to it, Nikon's very close to it, but I just think the image stabilization that Canon does is the best. So other L lenses I would recommend. I recommend the 300 f4 lens. You might think that's a bit long, but for portraits it's fantastic. It's razor sharp as well, and you can stick a what they call an extender or a teleconverter. What that does is it extends the focal length. It's something you put in between the camera and the lens, and unlike the extension tubes I mentioned, the teleconverter just makes it longer. So it would turn a 200mm lens, the 1.4 teleconverter or extender, would turn that to a 280mm lens. obviously with these teleconverters you lose a lot of light because there's more glass. So a 1.4 teleconverter you lose one stop of light. A 2 times teleconverter you lose 2 stops of light. It's quite fun using 2 times teleconverters, but I always don't find them to be that sharp. But the 1.4 teleconverters are really nice, very sharp. I have no problem using that one. So I recommend getting hold of that if you can. Canon do an older lens. Now it's a 400mm f5.6 lens. Now it is old and it doesn't have any image stabilization. The 300 that I mentioned does have 2 stops of image stabilization. Now this 400 is quite old. A lot of photographers still buy it because it's one of the cheapest ways of getting into serious wildlife and sports photography, and it is by far the cheapest way of getting into it. Both lenses, the 300 and the 400, retail for around $1,200 or £1,000, and they're razor sharp. They're extremely sharp, and I would certainly recommend either of those lenses. So you mentioned landscape in your question, landscape photography. What you've got to remember is when you get landscape lenses or wide angle lenses, especially the zoom ones, is they have a habit of bowing the lines of buildings, because that's the nature of what they do. They distort the image to such an extent that sometimes it can be unpleasant, the look. So going really wide angle, you might think is great for getting lots of landscapes in, and it is, but what you've got to remember is any straight lines will be bowed like that, and it's not a good look. So if you're serious about doing landscapes, try and stick to 24mm, or ideally I prefer 30 or 35mm. I don't like to go under that, to be honest with you. The only time I go wider than that is if I have to do an interior building, or I want to do a bit of a blogging in a tight space. I might use a really wide lens for that, because you tend to get a similar look to what you do in fisheye lenses. And if you don't know what a fisheye lens is, it's basically a lens that fits a huge amount of the room in, but it's so distorted. If you don't know what a fisheye lens is, it's basically something that can get most of the room in your shot. However, it's so distorted, it's looking through the eye of a fish. That's why it's called a fisheye lens. It can give you an interesting look. The problem is the corners are cut off and are black. So it gives you like a ring round your image. The only way of getting rid of that is to crop in or zoom in if you have a variable zoom on your fisheye. There's not many of those around, so it's unlikely. A lot of people talk to me and recommend the Sigma 30 and 35mm lenses. While they probably are very sharp and very good, I would tend to prefer to stick with Canon. If you come across any Sigma lenses, they don't tend to be well made, because another YouTuber you may wish to check out is called Angry Photographer. He does a lot of videos about Sigma, and he does say that most of them fail very quickly in a short space of time. So if you want a lens that's going to last you a long time, I'd recommend you stick with Canon, to be honest with you. I've had Sigma lenses and they were fine, no issues. However, sometimes the build quality is questionable. I know Sigma have brought out some sport lenses which are more durable, made of aluminium and are tougher. But again, I still think the reason Canon has been around for so long and why their lenses sell on eBay, just check eBay out. You can see Canon lenses that have been around for 10, 15 years and they're still sold on eBay. Try and find a Sigma lens that's 5 years old for sale on eBay. you will struggle to find it, guaranteed. If you want to go to the ultimate of zoom or ultimate of prime lenses, surely we can't discount the mega zooms that you see on the football grounds and the wildlife photographers out there. We call them the big whites, and they are very, very expensive. Don't get me wrong, they are razor sharp. In fact, the 500 f4 lens has got to be one of the sharpest lenses out there. Guess what? Guess how much the Mark II costs? Let me put it this way. You could buy a car for the amount of money that lens costs. $12,000. A lot of money in there. And there are some cheaper alternatives that you can go for, such as the 400DO f4 lens. That's a lot cheaper, probably setting you back about $4,000. Canon also do a 400 2.8 lens. Extremely big, extremely expensive, about $8,000. So, you know, if you do want to go serious in photography, you can, as you can tell, it is an expensive hobby. So expensive. I've probably spent something in the region of £8,000 in lenses and camera equipment. But one thing I did want to point out is, don't be afraid of buying second-hand equipment off Amazon and eBay. I bought a 7D for £400, which works out about $600 I think, and I've still got it 4 years later, you know. Also consider buying second-hand lenses. You know, I owned a 70-200 Mark I lens, which had 3 stops of image stabilisation. Not quite as good as the 4 stops of the Mark II does, but it was just as good. As far as I know, the main difference is, apart from that 1 stop of image stabilisation on the 70-200 Mark I versus Mark II, I think colours were slightly different, and that were it really. But the choice is yours, Tracy. You've got to understand. I hope I haven't rambled on too long in this video, but I just wanted to suggest that there's many lenses out there. It all depends on your budget. So if you don't have a lot of money, go for the EFS lenses. If you have time or you wish to invest more money, consider the L lenses. I think if I were you and I was just building up my collection and I bought the EFS lenses, I would think about buying the Canon 300 f4 lens and test the waters, use that for a while, see how I liked it. Maybe buy the 1.4 extender and put it on there. That's the route I started with. And then from there on, I went to the 70-200 2.8 lens. I bought the Mark I first and then sold that and got the Mark II. And after that, I sort of looked for extreme telephoto lenses such as the Sigma 150-600 and the Canon 100-400 Mark II lens. That's also a very expensive lens. I believe that's about $3,000 or $3,500 or £2,500. That 100-400 Mark II lens is very sharp, fantastic lens, great for tracking. Found the focus a little bit on the slow side when focusing close up, but it's still a good lens. So I hope this video was a bit informative about what different lenses you can get for your camera. Just remember the crop factor of 1.6 has an effect on any lens you buy. So if you buy a lens that's aimed on a full frame camera, such as the 5D, you need to take that 1.6 crop factor into account. So it turns, as I said, 50mm becomes 80mm, or 200 becomes 280mm. The problem is, it's fantastic if you want to do telephoto work, that's fine, because you get more reach. However, if you want to go wide angle, it's a problem. Then you have to rethink about what lens you're going to use. Using a full frame 24mm lens, which is a good wide angle lens, on a crop sensor camera like you've got, isn't great because it'll give you about 38mm. While it is still quite wide angle, but it's not fantastic for getting lots of real estate, such as property photography or landscapes in the actual shot. So, as I said, you're going to have to think about using EFS lenses such as that 10-18 to get the wide angle. I hope I haven't rambled on too long in this video, but like I said in the message I sent you, is it can be quite extensive depending on your needs, how much money you've got, whether you want to upgrade your camera to a more professional camera, or whether you want to sell your crop sensor camera and go full frame. Now, the advantage of full frame is it lets more light in, and it gives you better image quality, gives you more depth of field as well when you're using lenses like 1.8. I tend to use my 5D Mark II that I picked up second hand off eBay for doing landscapes, because I've got a 24-80mm L lens, and I like to keep it at around 30mm on that lens on the 5D, because the 5D gets me 24mm. If I stick the same lens on a crop sensor camera, right, such as the 80D I'm filming on now, it goes from 24mm to 38mm, so I get less landscapes in the actual shot. So you've got to think about that. And I think if I was starting out, and I would probably think about getting a second-hand 5D camera, because you can pick the original 5D camera, which is 12.8 megapixels, but it's full frame, and you can pick them up really cheap for about $500. And then you'd have the best of both worlds. You'd have full frame and a crop sensor. And it's, if you're serious about doing photography, Stacey, such as doing weddings and portraits, you'll want a backup camera. If you're serious about doing weddings or portraiture, you'll really want to get a second camera, just as a backup camera. You don't have to buy the latest and greatest. Just buy something that you can use just in case your camera fails, because it's always a possibility. So I hope this video has been informative about the various lenses. I know it's a minefield, I know it can be complicated. I didn't want to bamboozle you with such different scenarios, different lenses, and just throw them at you in a nonsensical way. But I just wanted to try and explain the different options that are out there, and I hope you found it useful. I'd be interested to find out what you finally went for, Stacey, such as EFS consumer lenses, which are a lot cheaper than the L lenses, or did you decide that you want to invest in your future and buy a few L lenses that will serve the test of time? L lenses will keep their value as well. That's another thing I want to point out. If you buy an L lens, right, and you sell it on eBay or Amazon, guaranteed you will get 80% of what you paid for it. If you try and sell a consumer lens, such as the EFS lenses, or a Sigma lens or a Tamron lens, you'll probably lose at least 50% of its value, possibly more.